Welcome to today's press conference. I'm delighted to introduce you to our press spokesperson, Fraser Myers, from the online magazine Spiked, and I'd like to welcome today's press corps from the United States and the Frederick Douglass Global Fellows Programme. Fraser.
Hello everyone. I've been asked to start by saying a few words about Brexit and Donald Trump because the two are often compared and seen as the same thing. And I think that there are some really important comparisons that we can make. You know, both of them were real shocks to the political system in 2016, real political earthquakes that few people saw coming. I think you could certainly say that they were both part of a populist wave that seems to be spreading across the West. That is, you know, defying expectations and really, you know, throwing a spanner in the works of the old political system. But I think that there are some really important key differences that I hope we can talk about later. I think one of the exciting things about Brexit is that it's an open-ended process. You know, we've said that we want to leave the European Union, but that doesn't actually give us a guide as to what comes next. It opens up politics by saying that, you know, we don't have to follow X, Y, and Z rules that we've been following for 20, 30 years, and that introduces new possibilities. Whereas with Donald Trump, it's a vote for a specific person and a specific set of ideas. Some of those ideas, I would say, are quite backward. Some of his ideas are welcome. I think he's less willing to intervene and start wars across the place than perhaps other presidents. I think that's a good thing. Perhaps it's a good thing that he has challenged, 25 years of, economic policy around free trade. But I think the rest of it is, his stance on immigration and things like that are quite backward. And, we can certainly talk about some of his racist tweets and things like that. I don't think that's progress by any means. But it is, nevertheless, chucking a bomb into the establishment. Potentially that could open things up, but I fear that it won't as much. I'm going to start with a question from Jasmine.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Garcia. I'm from the California State University of Fullerton. And given that the public voted for Brexit back in 2016 and no decision has been made, what would the implications of Brexit not happening have on democracy?
Well, the implications of Brexit not happening are enormous. The fact that, we're even able to ask this question, will Brexit happen? Will this thing that 17.4 million people voted for, this is the largest democratic mandate for any outcome in British history, and the fact is that there's an uncertainty as to whether we'll bother to do it, should itself indicate how serious it is. But we have had about 3 years of attempts to stop it from happening. We've had legal challenges through the courts attempting to overturn the Brexit vote. We've had members of Parliament who mostly, even though the public voted, a majority of them voted to leave, the vast majority of them voted to remain. Members of our unelected House of Lords are far and away more in favour of remaining in the European Union than leaving. And I think even people would say that the last Prime Minister, Theresa May, was a Remainer at heart and did what she could to frustrate Brexit rather than facilitate it, despite a lot of her kind of rhetoric around it. It's hard to actually imagine what would be the consequence of not delivering on this vote. I don't know whether people would be angry about it, and I'm not sure that people would take to the streets. I think the response would be much sadder. I think that people would lose interest in politics and think, well, if they can't even act on this, when are they ever going to listen to me? I think it would push people back away out of politics when we were just starting to re-engage people. And so I think that would be a real tragedy. Marissa?
Marissa Pereira from South East London. How optimistic are you that Boris Johnson is actually going to deliver Brexit? Because I have to say, I was a bit excited with the fact that he appointed a lot of Brexiteers to the cabinet.
Yeah.
But this is a guy that, he was a bit unsure what side to take before the referendum. He also gave in and actually voted in favour of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement.
Yeah.
So can we even trust him?
I would like to be optimistic about Boris Johnson, but I'm afraid the facts on the ground bring me back to being pessimistic again. For those of you who are not aware, Boris Johnson is making a fuss about how he's going to go for a no-deal Brexit, that come what may, by October 31st, we're out, which that would be nice because we're supposed to be out last time, March the 28th was the original deadline for leaving. And as Marissa says, there's lots of new members of the cabinet who are, much more in favour of leave than the last government. But at the same time, a lot of the things on the ground haven't changed that much. In fact, the cabinet is still mostly full of people who supported Remain. Most of them are not necessarily enthusiastic about a no-deal Brexit, even though they have all pledged to say that they will take this path. Out there in the country, big business is still opposed to Brexit. The House of Parliament, as I said before, is still opposed to Brexit. It's a welcome change at the top, but changing guard at the top doesn't necessarily change the facts on the ground. Anthony.
Hi, my name is Anthony Francois from John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. It was interesting that you brought up the no-deal Brexit. My question to you is, a no-deal Brexit is something that concerns a lot of people, particularly it concerns UK citizens who currently live and work in the EU, and likewise it would concern EU citizens who live and work in the UK with regards to the receipt of their health benefits and other benefits that their jobs provide. So my question to you really is there concern on these issues justified? Is there any sort of plan that the UK government has put in place to address the potential severing of their receiving of their benefits?
My understanding is that there are a number of plans in place to carry over a lot of things in the event of a no-deal Brexit. People are right to be concerned, especially if they're EU citizens. But I think what we've seen, particularly in the media or in response from some politicians, is not concern, but hysteria. So if you read the papers, you can find out about how no-deal Brexit is going to cause us to run out of food, run out of medicine. We're going to develop new diseases, including super gonorrhea. Genuinely, you can see some of these kind of more lurid stories out there. What does a no-deal Brexit really mean in practice? All it means is that we continue trading with the EU, as we do now, but we do so on World Trade Organization terms. Now, that's not ideal. It means tariffs on certain goods, and it means checks on goods at the border. But if you think about this rationally, most goods are checked at the border anyway because they're not coming from the European Union. Additional checks do mean queues, but it's not the end of the world. I mean, there are queues at Calais and there are delays every time there is bad weather, every time someone goes on strike, which happens a lot in Calais. Basically, there's just too much traffic and people haven't planned things properly. So I think that the catastrophism around no deal is completely unwarranted. The good thing about no deal is that it does, sever our political ties with the European Union, which is in line with what we voted for. I think later on there will need to be some kind of free trade deal with the European Union. I think that's important because people don't want there to be tariffs and people want goods to flow freely back and forth. But a no deal Brexit is nothing to be afraid of. Frederick, please.
My name is Frederick Lee, and I'm a business honors student at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. So my question is, so as UK being a part of the European Union, it has immediate access to more than 40 trade deals with more than 70 countries. However, with Brexit brewing in the air, Boris Johnson and President Donald Trump had a conversation about Brexit being an opportunity to strengthen the economic partnership by possibly 5 times bigger. How do you think this partnership will have an impact on America's colonialism or influence to the UK? Because this is not only about economic indicators, but politically and socially as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are arguing that a trade deal with America translates into some kind of US takeover of the UK, and I think maybe that is a little bit far. I think one thing that's worth noting is that a lot of the conversation around Brexit, particularly from some of the more kind of right-wing Brexiteers, is that they are kind of obsessed with trade, and they think that we will trade more with the world if we leave the EU and we sign all these trade deals with America and South America and India and all these things. And I think it's a bit of a distraction from a lot of the real issues, to be honest with you. The fact is we already trade a lot with America. People do this thing where they say, well, our biggest trade partner is the EU. Well, yes, it is, but that's 27 different countries. But in terms of a single country, the UK's biggest trade partner is the US. And we don't have a trade deal with the US, and yet trade is just fine. So I think that we can actually afford to stand up for ourselves in the context of a trade deal, trade negotiations. We don't have to give in to everything. There are some quite ridiculous fears around a US trade deal. I don't know how people are very worried. Apparently, in America, you all eat chlorinated chicken, and this is very bad for you, as I can see you all looking very unhealthy. And I think that the discussions around America are part of the general catastrophism about Brexit and the kind of gloom that everything is going to be horrible. Yes, your follow-up question.
My name's Quintin Radcliffe, and I'm a faculty member with CIEE, or the Council on International Education Exchange. My follow-up question is that you alluded to deeper issues. Can you say something about what you think those deeper issues are, or deeper reasons? I think what are those?
Yeah, in terms of pursuing Brexit and why people might have voted for it, I think it's very interesting. I think the main reason in the country why people voted to leave the EU is surrounding democracy and national sovereignty. People recognise that there are vast parts of UK law that are decided by the European Union, which basically British citizens or any European citizens have no real control over. And I think that that's what that kind of slogan that they used in the campaign, "Take Back Control," really signified. People wanted to take back control over laws. Borders was the other aspect, so there was an immigration aspect to it where people knew that whatever government they elected, that government was pretty much powerless to have its own rules around immigration. So I would say that that's the deeper aspect. But what's interesting is that among the very few Brexit supporting people in the elite, in the establishment, what they're most excited about is global free trade, which I think actually they're very much at odds with the Brexit voters because I think the average Brexit voter probably isn't too bothered about seeing tariffs on goods if it will protect British industry. So there's an interesting tension there, I think. Question from Henry, please.
My name is Henry Sayu, and I'm representing Benedict College. As you may know, Facebook has been tried for censoring conservative content disproportionately compared to similar liberal content. And Google has recently been tried by U.S. Senate for implementing an algorithm that may have interfered with the elections by shifting at least 2.6 million votes in favor of Hillary Clinton. So, with their overwhelming influence over the public, is there concern that these tech giants may be carrying out similar influence in UK politics? And if so, what could be done about it?
I think there's two kind of separate worries. I think there's one worry which I think is expressed the most, which is around the use of targeted adverts. And I think people overstate that worry. There is an assumption that this new technology is more manipulative than normal adverts and can persuade people to vote for things that they wouldn't otherwise vote for. I think that that's a misplaced concern. But I think what people are right to be concerned about is when, as you've alluded to, if we find out that tech platforms are suppressing certain political views or making certain views less seen via the algorithms, rather than through their sort of natural popularity. We haven't really seen this in terms of mainstream candidates in the UK, but with a lot of fringe candidates who have stood for election have found themselves censored by Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So Tommy Robinson, he's a kind of right-wing, kind of racist, rabble-rouser, but he was standing for election in the European elections, and his materials were pretty much banned from all of the main social media sites. Now, I don't like Tommy Robinson, I don't approve of a single thing that this man says, but it is extremely worrying to have, the terms of political debate pretty much determined by, these big mega tech companies in Silicon Valley. And I think that that's something we have to be really vigilant about and call it out when we see it, because that could really pose a problem for future democratic elections and debate.
So carrying on with the theme of interference, whereas what happens in Silicon Valley may be seen as a form of soft interference, I think hard interference very much does exist when a foreign entity, such as Russia or whatever Britain's formidable enemies may be, interfere with their election. As far as that goes, what can be done to deter foreign interference in your election and your political processes?
You can never stop malign actors from trying to interfere in elections. America has interfered in elections all around the world. There's obviously the kind of Russia scandal, and there is this sense that Russia interfered in either the election of Trump or in the Brexit vote in a way that pushed the dial towards a certain outcome. And when you look at the evidence for what that interference amounted to, it just doesn't stack up. I mean, I've seen some of the memes and things like that they've managed to trace back to the Russian government, and they're some of the silliest things you can imagine. You know, there's one of Bernie Sanders in like a rainbow flag, and you know, it's all this kind of weird stuff that I don't think persuaded many people to back one side or the other. Or in the Brexit vote, it was eventually they after weeks and weeks of people saying, oh, Russia did Brexit, they eventually discovered, you know, after some investigation, the Russian government spent about £5 or something on adverts, you know, which is seen by only a handful of people. The whole discussion around that, around foreign interference, seems to me to mostly be a way of avoiding the reality of the results, of not an unwillingness to confront the fact that Brexit won the EU referendum or that Donald Trump won the presidential election. Elisa.
Hello, how you doing? Elisa
Hi.
Fowler from Hawkwind College. So there's been a lot of talk around trade amongst the U.S. and the U.K., and it was noted that Donald Trump had made a statement that he wanted access to the NHS, and that caused a panic within a lot of people. Do you see a future problem if he retrieves access to the NHS?
It's an interesting one. I think this is another one of those misplaced fears. The biggest threat to the British NHS is whichever British government is in charge of it at the time. We shouldn't blame the Americans if things go to pot, is the short answer. What people are worried about is that the free trade deal with America, if we ever, assuming we leave and assuming we get such a deal, will be used as a pretext for privatising the NHS, for handing aspects of it to American companies. But the fact is that it is already largely, a lot of it is already privatised, and there are already American companies working in the British Health Service. You know, as I said before, you don't need these trade deals for trade to happen. You don't need a trade deal for the British government to outsource its services to an American company. So I think it's one of those kind of red herring issues that has been blown out of all proportion as a way of basically bashing Brexit. Daniela.
So, hello, my name is Daniela Quiñones, and I am from the University of Texas at El Paso. There is a lot of panic about the possibility of getting a hard border in Ireland. So, is there a reason to really be alarmed about it, and what are some solutions to that problem?
I think it's a really interesting question, and my view is that the fears around a hard border are a product of reading history backwards, essentially. You know, Northern Ireland has a very troubled history, or we even call it the Troubles, a civil war in Ireland between the British state and Irish Republicans. And the reason that there was a border in Northern Ireland was to basically stop, you know, the IRA crossing the border at this difficult time. But what people are doing today is they're saying that the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was the cause of the violence. So it seems to be an almost complete inversion of reality. Now, it's very clear that people who live, especially near the border, do not want a border to return, because life has developed in such a way. You know, there are basically roads where you can have half the road on the Northern Irish side and half the road on the Irish side, and they cross over. And you know, it's not very practical to have checkpoints. And so yeah, I completely understand the anxiety of those people that a hard border of some sorts might return. But at the same time, this is a matter of political will. The only reason we would need to erect a border is if the EU says we have to, because it wants to protect its own market from interference with, you know, British goods. Their worry is that our product standards, for instance, will be lowered in relation to Europe's, and that people will start smuggling things into the European Union's single market. Now, the likelihood of that is pretty slim. There's no reason to actually erect a border in those circumstances unless, you know, you have the political will to do so. In the long term, you need a kind of a better solution, but I think lots of people have worked out ideas for doing that. There are ways in which you can pretty much have goods inspected at the factory, for instance. You can have border checkings inland, so they're not across the border, and you can leave ordinary people alone who are just driving around. There's no reason to check their passports or anything like that. There are already agreements between the UK and Ireland that predate the European Union that say that you don't have to show your passport to go from one to the other. So those could still apply for ordinary people, but bigger businesses could have, in-factory checks. There are a whole load of creative and quite sensible ways of resolving this.
Thank you.
Jabril?
My name is Jabril Bing, Frederick Douglass Global Fellow. I've heard some people say Donald Trump's tweets about the Democratic Squad are racist, but do you think Donald Trump's tweets are more about using the squad's views to make their entire Democratic Party seem as eccentric in their views as these four congresswomen?
Yeah, I agree with both parts of that question. I think his tweets about them were racist. I know there are some Republicans who are trying to slime their way out of saying these are racist, but if you're telling people who are born in America or who are naturalized citizens of America, then to go home, then that's racist. I don't really see any argument there. But is there an underlying tactic to it? Perhaps, and I think you've kind of alluded to something that has been going on for a while now. The squad, as you say, I think although they're very popular on social media, I think they actually represent quite a fringe section of the Democratic Party. The vast majority of Democrats out there are moderate, which is probably why you can see someone like Joe Biden polling so highly compared to other more interesting candidates. But I think a lot of people just want to go back to normal. But it's quite clever in a sense. If Trump is able to associate this group of people with, I don't know, what people would see as quite out there views on immigration, woke views around identity politics, then he could essentially paint the entire Democratic Party as out there organisation, rather than one that is, which I think is too moderate, but that's that's the reality of it. Marley.
Marlena Cowlad, South London. Our speaker bans in universities in the US and UK implications of a broader and more threatening view on censorship in the world today.
Yes, I think so. Universities are actually often at the kind of sharp end of the broader problem we have, I think, with freedom of speech. The attempts to say that pretty much every view is offensive and cannot be heard. A lot of that is coming from universities, but now has a kind of broader resonance in society. So, certainly in the UK, those of us who are, campaigning for free speech 5 years ago were constantly talking about universities shutting things down. Now we have to talk about the police shutting people down, for expressing views that are just basically not politically correct, not even fascist views, not even really extreme views. People are finding themselves in trouble for expressing quite ordinary opinions, telling jokes, and even writing poems. Someone was recently had a phone call from the police for writing an offensive poem. So the bans on speakers in universities are just perhaps the clearest example of a wider climate that is intolerant of free speech and doesn't understand the value of free speech and hearing opinions that we don't always agree with. And I think it's interesting in relation to Brexit and Trump how many of us or many people did not see these things coming, and there's a sense in which perhaps those views, because they're not politically correct, perhaps people kept them to themselves and certainly were not willing to tell opinion pollsters about how they're going to vote. And I think perhaps that might have been different if we approached these issues with a bit more openness.
Quintin again from CIEE. Can you give us some idea of the laws related to hate speech versus freedom of speech in the UK?
Yeah, so we have laws against hate speech in the UK, and the problem with them is that they're in almost, well, I think they're a problem anyway. I don't think that anyone can give me a consistent definition of what constitutes hate speech as opposed to non-hate speech. And even if you look at, basically the European Court of Human Rights definition of hate speech, it's basically just repeating itself. Hate speech is speech that is hateful, which is really unhelpful. So these are lawyers paid to come up with this rubbish. The problem is that it's entirely subjective. the definition of hate speech in the UK is basically speech that causes offence to people on the basis of race, religion, sexuality. I think transgender is a separate one, but the way that you decide whether something is hateful or not is on the basis of pretty much whether the person hearing it or any other person decided that it was hateful. So there's no rigorous test to see X is hateful, Y is hateful. There's no process for deciding that. It's merely that someone subjectively felt that something is offensive. And so the result of this is pretty catastrophic for free speech. Around 9 people per day are arrested in the UK on the basis of literally saying offensive things just on the internet. Just being rude about other people, essentially, online. There was a woman, a young woman, 19 years old. She had actually suffered from, Asperger's syndrome, so she's autistic. She was arrested and put in an ankle tag for quoting rap lyrics that featured the N-word. Now, you can look up this song. Anyone can look up this song. It's on YouTube. You can watch it legally in the UK, and it's got, millions and millions of hits. But when she quoted it in an Instagram post, the police saw it and said, this is you can't use language like that. That's offensive, and they took her to, basically put her through the ringer. So there's some really shocking cases of really obvious misjustices around hate speech, and so that's why I think it's just best to get rid of the whole thing. I think you're much luckier in America than you may realise having a First Amendment that stops the government from interfering with the things you say and do both in your ordinary lives but also in politics. Kiwe, let's have your question.
Hi, my name is Kiwe, one of the Frederick Douglass Global Fellows. So my question is, I'm pretty sure you're aware of Sir Kim Darroch.
Derek, yeah.
Derek's recently resigned as a US to UK ambassador. So I was just wondering, how do you forecast the future relationship, international relationship between UK US in the future with his retirement?
I think his resignation has kind of drawn a line under that particular affair. But I do have a problem with the way that he was kind of forced out. It should be up to a government to appoint its ambassadors, and that shouldn't be interfered with from anyone else. So, Trump famously basically said this guy was a loser and, he had to go. And it would have been completely unacceptable had the British government sacked him at that point, under instruction from another country. That would have completely torn the whole kind of fabric of diplomacy apart. Ambassadors certainly need to be able to tell the truth, say what they think about leaders, and I think Kim Darroch didn't hold back in his private criticisms of Trump, which is fair enough. But I think in terms of the future relations, I think it seems to have drawn a line under the affair, his resignation. I personally, I think they should have let him stay for a couple of months and then forgotten about it. Jessica?
Hello, I'm Jessica and representing UC Berkeley. Fascism is defined as an authoritarian and nationalistic right-wing system of government. Going back to your earlier comment, you mentioned that the real tragedy is you're afraid that people will stop being engaged in politics. And Trump, Brexit Party, Boris Johnson have all been called fascists. Is that a problem, or do you assume that this will be a problem for the citizens to have full confidence in the parliamentary system? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I have a problem with the way that fascism is kind of bandied around. It just doesn't give us an honest account of what is happening, especially if you're opposed to these movements, which is the people using these words are. You have to understand what you're fighting against, and so dismissing something as fascist immediately, you're harming yourself first of all by refusing to understand what it is you're talking about. Also, it's really bad because it downplays the significance of fascism. Of fascism when it really occurred, particularly in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. Particularly the Holocaust in relation to Nazi Germany. This is truly one of the most despicable events in human history. I mean, it's uniquely evil, and there is nothing for all of Trump's many faults that even comes close to that, and certainly not of someone like Nigel Farage, who has never even come close to tasting power and doesn't hold fascistic views. At the end of the day, he is a campaign for democracy. That's kind of what he's organising himself around, so it seems a bit odd to call him a fascist. Boris Johnson is actually, quite liberal for a conservative. He has very liberal views on immigration. He wants to have an amnesty for long-term illegal immigrants. He's just appointed the most ethnically diverse cabinet in British history. Now, you might say that's a bit of window dressing or whatever. What's it really mean? But I think if the idea that these people are fascists is some way away from the truth. We should criticise them for what they do, not what we imagine them to do.
Aileen O'Reilly, you mentioned that Boris Johnson has been labelled as a metropolitan liberal. Do you believe that he's the best person to deliver Brexit and that he's the Brexit saviour, as he's been quoted? And what about the opinions of pro-Brexiters but not pro-Tories?
Yeah, I think those are two good questions. I don't think Boris Johnson is necessarily the saviour of Brexit. I think, we'll have to wait and see, really, don't we? But I don't think he has the balls to pull it off, personally. The way that Brexit is often framed is that it's actually this right-wing idea. Surveys have been carried out that say that there is no more people who are left-wing or right-wing are no more likely to have voted Leave or Remain. There's no correlation between people's views on the kind of left-right, particularly on the economic axis, and Brexit. And we know that at least 4 million people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 for the Labour Party voted to leave. I mean, if you take the longer view, who might have voted Labour in the last 10 years, there could be 6-7 million of those people who are kind of Labour leavers or left-wing leavers. I know lots of left-wing leavers. In fact, I don't know anyone who would call themselves, for instance, a Marxist and not be a leaver. So I think those people definitely shouldn't be neglected. I think the Labour Party has made a massive mistake in turning its back on those people, especially as many of them are coming from, the kind of working class backgrounds or, industrial heartlands of the north. Those are the places that are going to be very let down by Labour abandoning Brexit. So yeah, certainly Brexit's not a Tory phenomenon at all. And with any luck, Brexit has already brought down 2 Conservative governments. Maybe it will bring down Boris as well. So, that could be something to be excited about. Hayley.
I'm Hayley Smith, Clark Atlanta student, and my question is, the UK and the US are considered melting pots of the world, and with the borders rising and changing, how do you think this will affect the social, economic, and political atmosphere of these countries?
I think that's interesting. I mean, I would question how much of a change in terms of actual policy these things represent. So there's kind of 2 parts that I kind of want to answer. And one is that obviously there is an element of the Brexit vote and an element of the Trump vote that was about controlling immigration. But in terms of what's actually changing, I think we have to remember that most of the wall, quote unquote, in the US already exists. Was laid down by previous administrations. Trump, it seems to be ramping up a lot of deportations, but as far as I'm aware, Obama still holds the record for the most migrants deported in his term, deporting more migrants than all previous presidents combined. So whether this represents a sea change in actual policy, I'm sceptical of. I think there's a change in rhetoric. And in the European context, we have always had a kind of 2-tier immigration system. One is, we have freedom of movement for people from the European Union, but we have a kind of points-based immigration system for people who are not from the European Union, so people from outside. And there's always been restrictions on those people coming in. And then, more broadly, in terms of the rest of the EU, we refer to this often as Fortress Europe. There is a external border around the 27 member states that basically pretty much prevents vast numbers of people, particularly from Africa and Asia, from coming into the European Union. And that's been around for since the 90s, basically. And it's led to some enormous, some real humanitarian crises. I mean, the reason that so many people were drowning in the Mediterranean is because of the existence of this, what we call Fortress Europe. So my view is that actually immigration has always kind of been quite restrictive, and certainly there's a change in the tenor of the debate. People are, certainly, Trump is more obviously anti-immigration, but have the facts changed? I'm not so sure.
So you don't think that with the changes there will be a social difference, an economic difference, or anything like that?
On the one hand, I think in Britain we had started to see less migrants come because they'd heard about Brexit, and that created a lot of uncertainty for people, especially from the European Union. But on the other hand, just heard that Boris is going to get rid of the attempts to drive immigration down to a certain level. So I think things are very much up in the air. I can't really speak for the US so much on that question.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for at today's news conference. I'd like to thank Fraser Myers, our press spokesperson from Spiked Online, and I'd like to thank our press corps from America in particular, and some of the volunteers from London.